Good afternoon. I'm David Luberoff, the Center's Deputy Director, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's talk by Alex Hermann on the geography of renter financial distress during the pandemic. Before I introduce Alex, I want to let you know about some other upcoming talks. Our speaker series will continue next Tuesday at 11 a.m. when Deyanira Del Rio, co-director of the New Economy Project, a nonprofit active in New York City, will give the second of 4 talks in our series on housing finance and social equity. That series will continue a week later on Tuesday, March 14th, with a talk by Bill Bynum, who leads HOPE, which works to strengthen communities in the Deep South. The talks, which are being co-sponsored by MIT's Department of Urban Studies and Planning and its Golub Center for Finance and Policy, will be hybrid events, and the in-person portion will be at MIT. In addition, on Thursday, March 23rd at 12:30 p.m., we'll release our biennial Improving America's Housing Report with an online panel discussion. 5 days later, on the evening of Tuesday, March 28th, Andy Bernheimer, a New York-based architect whose firm has designed several notable new affordable housing projects, will give the 22nd annual John T. Dunlop Lecture. That'll be a hybrid event. The in-person portion will be at Harvard's Graduate School of Design. More information about these and other upcoming events are available on our website. Now on to today's presentation. Our speaker, my colleague Alex Hermann, is a research associate here at the Joint Center for Housing Studies. He'll be discussing findings from a recently released center working paper on the geography of renter financial distress and housing insecurity during the pandemic. Alex is a co-author of that paper, along with our colleagues Sophia Wedeen, Whitney Airgood-Obrycki, and Chris Herbert. Sophia, Whitney, and Chris are also on this webinar and may be answering some of your questions online. Alex is going to speak for about 35 to 40 minutes, and then he'll answer your questions for about 20 minutes. We'll bring things to an end at about 1:15 p.m. As I mentioned, you can submit questions via Zoom's Q&A feature, or you can also indicate your interest in questions posed by others. We'll wrap things up, as I said, by about 1:15 p.m. My apologies in advance if, as seems quite likely, we don't get to all of your questions. We will share them all with Alex and his co-authors. Alex, it's all yours.
All right, thank you, David. I appreciate that. I'm going to share my screen now, and I trust you'll let me know if we have any issues here. And thanks to everyone else for being here with me. As David mentioned, I'm Alex Hermann. I'm a researcher at the Joint Center here. I'll be presenting today on the geography of renter financial distress and housing insecurity during the pandemic. That's the title of the talk, but also happens to be the title of the working paper that David mentioned that we published earlier this year through the Joint Center, along with my 3 co-authors, who I will say again, Sophia Wedeen, Whitney Airgood-Obrycki, and Chris Herbert. We're going to cover a lot of ground here today in this presentation, but there's certainly much more in the paper that I think is worth digging into. So I hope you'll check it out. What I'm going to start with here, though, is some higher level key findings. So using data from the U.S. Census Bureau's Household Pulse Survey, our paper found that renter households were more likely to experience financial distress in high poverty, lower income, and lower rent neighborhoods from April 2021 through February 2022, as well as neighborhoods with higher shares of people of color. And by financial distress, we mean here that these renter households lost employment income or fell behind on their rent at higher rates in these neighborhood types. And given that renters are unevenly distributed geographically, renter financial distress is extremely concentrated. So, for example, about 2/5 of renters behind on their ongoing housing payments lived in high poverty or lower income neighborhoods, while more than 3/5 lived in communities of color. So in other words, large shares of renters behind on their rent lived in higher poverty census tracts and in tracts with higher shares of people of color. Emergency rental assistance application and acceptance rates were also concentrated in these same neighborhood types, indicating that federal rental assistance is likely reaching neighborhoods with the greater need. So that's the endpoint, right? In some sense, at least. We'll revisit all of these key findings throughout the presentation, but for now, let's step back and talk a bit about how we got there. And maybe the right starting point is with some background. Here are a few things that we knew going into this study, building on existing research we've done at the center, including other papers that we've written explicitly on how the pandemic has affected renter households. But part of longer term trends that, of course, precede the pandemic, renter households were disproportionately harmed by the financial fallout of the pandemic. And that's especially true among lower income renters and renters of color. At the same time, there are also enduring patterns of economic and racial segregation in the US. And as a result, lower income renters and renters of color are geographically concentrated at the neighborhood level across the country. So we hypothesized then that as a result, the financial fallout of the pandemic is also geographically concentrated and disproportionately affects certain neighborhoods, right? Those I mentioned previously with higher poverty, lower income, lower rent, and in neighborhoods with a higher share of people of color. To illustrate a couple of these points briefly, I wanted to pull in a few data points outside our study for some context. Using the same survey, the household pulse survey that we dig into for our paper, the State of the Nation's Housing 2022 reports that a high share of lower income households and households of color fell behind on their rent in early 2022. So about 21% of renters earning under $25,000 and 17% of renters earning $25,000 to $35,000 were behind on their payments in the early spring of last year, compared with under 5% of higher income households. Meanwhile, just under a quarter of Black and under a fifth of Hispanic and Asian renters were also behind on their rent, and that compares with about 10% of white renters. At the same time, the US population also lives in extremely segregated neighborhoods. According to one Brookings study we referenced in the paper, the neighborhood of the average white resident in the 100 largest metro areas lived in a neighborhood that was 71% white in 2014 to 2018, while the average Black and Hispanic resident lived in a neighborhood that was nearly 70% people of color. This would be a problem in and of itself, but the issues become more compounded when that racial segregation leads to the isolation of lower income households. So according to that same study, over 80% of low income Black people and about 3/4 of low income Hispanic people live in low income neighborhoods, compared with just under half of low income white residents. So those are our stylized facts, given some greater depth, right? But I think it's also still fair to ask the question, why should we care about the neighborhood context of renter financial distress during the pandemic? Here we offer three reasons. The first is about people who own and operate rental housing. Other studies have shown that during the pandemic, landlords who anticipated or experienced rent shortfalls in their units were more likely to defer maintenance or miss payments on their mortgage, on their utilities, or on their property taxes. So if rental arrears are concentrated in specific neighborhoods, then the loss of rental income for landlords will also be concentrated, perhaps leading to systematic disinvestment and ultimately foreclosure in these neighborhoods. Second, housing insecurity, including evictions, has been found to be highly concentrated, and that's true long before the pandemic, right? And during the pandemic, landlords facing large rent shortfalls were more likely to pursue evictions. As a result, concentration of rental arrears in higher poverty neighborhoods and in communities of color has the potential to increase housing instability in these neighborhoods, including through increased evictions, and that could have destabilizing, compounding effects on those neighborhoods. Lastly, we've written previously, and my colleague Sophia Wedeen gave a talk, I believe a year ago, about the spillover effects of financial distress and how frequently renter households experiencing financial distress had to borrow from family and friends to meet their essential spending needs. This was especially common, again, among lower income households and households of color, In this paper, we posit that these social networks might also be geographically concentrated, and thus the financial spillover identified in the previous paper may also have broader spillover effects in the neighborhoods these households reside in. After that somewhat elongated preamble, here are our research questions. How did lost employment income and rental arrears vary by neighborhood type? To what extent were lost employment income for renter households and the share of renters behind on their rent geographically concentrated by neighborhood type? How did those financial harms vary by household income and the race or ethnicity of the householder? And how do they vary across neighborhood types? And then how did ERA application and acceptance rates vary by neighborhood type? Were ERA applicants and recipients similarly concentrated? Did the areas of greatest need actually get the highest acceptance application rates of actual ERA allotment? But before we go into our results and how we answered that question, I'm going to briefly discuss our data and how we went about doing that. For this study, we're using restricted access or internal use data from the Household Pulse Survey. We access these data through the Census Bureau's Research Data Center here in Cambridge, and I'll explain to you what internal use and restricted access means in just a second. Just like the public Household Pulse Survey, the internal HPS has a rich set of demographic and economic data on U.S. households and has been fielded intermittently since the start of the pandemic. And during the period under study here, the HPS was fielded every other week. The one key difference with the internal file for the purposes of our study is we know the census tract, which we're using as a proxy for a neighborhood, that almost every renter household resides in. And this knowledge will obviously ultimately allow us to say something about the neighborhood context of financial distress that we wouldn't have access to otherwise. The HPS is conducted in different phases and in different weeks, right? So to boost our sample in these neighborhoods, and because there's general consistency in sampling and some of the key questions asked over this period, we combine different waves of the HPS from April 2021 through February 2022, and that produces an overall sample of about 200,000 renters. The HPS isn't meant to be geographically representative at the census tract level. So we obtain high-level neighborhood characteristics from the 5-year American Community Survey in 2015 to 2019. So overall, we map those neighborhood characteristics in the American Community Survey onto the individual households we observe in the Pulse Survey. Our methods are purely descriptive here. However, I'll flag now that our concentration analysis has some quirks, but I'll discuss that more in just a minute. Here are our key variables and where we're pulling them from. So our major indicators of financial distress come from the Household Pulse Survey, as I mentioned previously. They include whether or not a household lost employment income in the previous 4 weeks, if that household reports being behind on their rental payments at the time of survey, and then if a renter applied for and had subsequently received emergency rental assistance. We turn all these variables into dummy variables and report the share of each as kind of our key indicator. Household characteristics come from the HPS as well and include the race, ethnicity of the household, their household income, and the region these households reside in. And then our neighborhood characteristics that come from the ACS that we report out in the paper include the poverty rate, the neighborhood median household income, the neighborhood median gross rent, and the share of people of color living in the neighborhood. For the purposes of this talk, I'm really going to focus on rental arrears and our ERA measures. In terms of neighborhood characteristics, we're going to look primarily at the neighborhood poverty rate and the share of people of color, though you see similarities when you look at the median household income and median rent, but we dig into that more in the paper. Before going into the results, I'm going to say just a few words about some data challenges and limitations. The first two are relevant to any work using the household pulse survey. First, the HPS has very low response rates. We use census provided household weights in our analysis, which should mitigate some of that potential non-response bias that might come along from that high levels of non-response. Another potential issue is that these indicators of financial distress are all self-reported, and interpretations of those questions could vary. Think about emergency rental assistance and what that could mean to different households. It could be, in their mind, a reference to other kinds of programs. Beyond that, there are some concerns that the measure of rental non-payment might be artificially inflated by renters who miss payments at different points in time over the course of the month, or if those renters are protected by tenant protections like an eviction moratorium. But these concerns, to the extent we have them at all, are only really salient for us if differences in self-reporting really vary systematically by neighborhood characteristics. But the bigger issue really is the geographic representativeness of the pulse survey. So the pulse survey wasn't necessarily designed to be representative at lower levels of geography. In the public data, you can only really obtain estimates at the state and metro area level for very large metros. So if we were looking at 1 week of the survey, it might be hard to make any reasonable inferences about how these trends play out by neighborhood characteristic. But one way we partially mitigate this problem is by pooling our sample size, like I mentioned earlier, across many weeks of the pulse survey. And that's going to boost our sample size. We also aggregate our census tract estimates of financial distress up to the national and regional level. So we're only reporting out these characteristics at the neighborhood level at a very higher level of geography in aggregate. But an important part of this study is examining the concentration of distress in these neighborhoods, given how concentrated renters are in the first place. So we checked to see if the concentration of renters in the HPS was consistent with other data sources, and in particular in the ACS, and we found some mixed results. So basically, all renter households in the pulse survey are about as concentrated as all renter households in the ACS. So like I say there, so 45% of tracts in the ACS and 42% of tracts in the pulse survey contain about 75% of all renters. But lower income renters earning under $25,000 were far more concentrated in the pulse survey. So about 39% of tracts in the ACS and 20% of tracts in the pulse survey contain 75% of low-income renters. Like I said, lower income renters are far more concentrated in the pulse survey. That difference in low-income renter concentration probably precludes us from looking directly at the concentration of these renter households in the pulse survey. Instead, we use the ACS to look at the number of renter households living in a given category of census tract, and then use the HPS estimates of the share of renters in those tracts experiencing financial distress to produce our estimates of concentration by neighborhood characteristics. And I think that might be a little complicated to comprehend. We're going to walk through some examples during the course of this talk. And that kind of almost begins now as we dig into some of the results. And we're going to begin by looking at the rates of financial distress by neighborhood type. Okay, so let's start with the left-hand side of this figure. So from mid-2021 to early 2022, about 15% of renters in our sample were behind on their rental payments. And there's a clear gradation if you break these rates down by neighborhood characteristic. As I think you'd probably expect, right? The rate of financial distress increases as the poverty rate in the neighborhood increases. So in lower poverty tracts where the poverty rate is under 5%, the share of households behind on their rent was about 12%. By comparison, in higher poverty tracts where at least 20% of the population lives in poverty, about 19% of renters were behind on their rent. So again, in lower poverty tracts, 12% of renters were behind on rent. In higher poverty tracts, 19% of renters were behind on their rent. On the right-hand side, you see the other indicator of financial distress we report out in the paper. Overall, 23% of renters in our sample lost employment income at some point in the prior 4 weeks. But again, the rates of lost income increase as the neighborhood poverty rate increases. So 20% of renters lost employment income in lower poverty tracts compared to 26.5% of renters in higher poverty tracts. Rates of financial distress also vary if you look at the share of people of color in the neighborhood. So in neighborhoods that are communities of color or where more than 40% of the population is a person of color, 18% of renters were behind on their rent and 28% lost employment income. And that's 7 and 6 percentage points higher, respectively, than renters in neighborhoods where under 20% of residents are people of color. We've discussed the rates of lost employment income until now to illustrate how both of these measures vary with their neighborhood context. We discussed them both throughout the paper, but for simplicity's sake here, and because there's more similarities than differences really, for the remainder of the presentation, I'm only going to show you rates of rental arrears or the share of renters behind on their rent. The rates of financial distress by neighborhood characteristic that I just showed are perhaps smaller than you'd expect, right? But these different rates still translate into significant concentration of distress because renters tend to live in the neighborhoods with the greatest rates of distress. For example, as we just discussed, about 19% of renters in higher poverty tracts were behind on their rent. At the same time, about 1/3 or 32% of those renters lived in those neighborhoods, right? And then another 1/3 of renters lived in neighborhoods with poverty rates in the 10 to 20% range, or about 15% of renters were behind on their rent. By contrast, just 10% of all renters lived in lower poverty neighborhoods, those same neighborhoods where the rates of financial distress were lowest. Similarly, over half of renters lived in communities of color where non-payment of rent was highest at about 18%, and about 1/4 of all renters lived in neighborhoods where the share of people of color was under 20% and 20 to 40%. But in those same neighborhoods, the rates of financial distress were closer to 12%. In other words, while renters are fairly concentrated geographically, they're also concentrated in the places experiencing the highest likelihood of distress. And as a result, renter financial distress is exceedingly concentrated in these neighborhoods. So here you see the distribution of all renters by neighborhood characteristic in the American Community Survey, represented by the blue bar, and then the implied distribution of renters behind on their rent, represented by the red bar. As I mentioned previously, to account for some potential geographic bias in the pulse survey, we calculate this distribution by multiplying out the share behind on their rent by tract characteristic that we see in the HPS and by the number of renters in those tracts according to the ACS. Overall, you see that 40% of renters behind on their payments lived in high poverty tracts, and another 1/3 lived in neighborhoods where the poverty rate was 10 to 19%. And 19% of renters lived in neighborhoods with poverty rate was 5 to 10%. But just 8% of renters lived in neighborhoods, just 8% of renters behind on their rent lived in lower poverty tracts. If you look at the right-hand side, that concentration is even more stark, right? So over 3/5 of renters in arrears, or 61%, lived in communities of color, while about 19% lived in neighborhoods where the share of people of color was under 20%. We examine how these trends play out by region as well. Rent arrears were highest in the South and the Northeast at just under 17% of renters, while about 13% of renters in the Midwest and 12% of renters in the West were behind on their payments. If you dig down and look at the neighborhood context, you see the same patterns emerge regionally that were evident nationally. And this is the same information as in the table just shown graphically. On the left, you have the rates of non-payment by region and neighborhood poverty rate. On the right, you have the same breakdown by the share of people of color in that neighborhood. As you can see by the red bar on both sides, the rates of rental arrears in all 4 regions were greatest in higher poverty neighborhoods and in communities of color. In higher poverty neighborhoods in the Northeast, 1/4 of renters were behind on their payments, just like 1/5 of renters in higher poverty neighborhoods were in the South, 18% in the West, and 14% in the West. 18% in the Midwest and 14% in the West. In communities of color, 23% of renters were behind on their payments in the Northeast, 18.5% in the South, and in the Midwest, and 14% in the West. One notable trend to point out is the much greater disparities across neighborhood contexts in the Northeast compared to other regions, which we hypothesize is related to the higher degree of racial and economic segregation in the Northeast. For example, the rate of rent arrears in higher poverty neighborhoods in the Northeast is about 12 percentage points higher than the rate of arrears in lower poverty neighborhoods in the region. The next highest margin is about 7 percentage points between higher and lower poverty neighborhoods in the Midwest. Using similar methods to what I showed you nationally, we also looked at the concentration of financial distress by region. So on the left side panel, you see that 41 to 45% of renters behind on their payments lived in higher poverty neighborhoods in the Northeast, in the South, and in the Midwest, while about 1/3 of renters behind on their rent lived in higher poverty neighborhoods in the West. And this is related to the fact that you have fewer higher poverty neighborhoods in the West, and as a result, fewer renters living in higher poverty neighborhoods. Still, under 10% of renters behind on their rent lived in lower poverty neighborhoods in all 4 regions. Looking at the concentration of rental arrears by region and the racial composition of the neighborhood, on the right side panel, you see that more than 2/3 of renters behind on their payments lived in communities of color in the Northeast, in the South, and the West, but about 40% of renters behind on their rent in the Midwest lived in communities of color. That's because only about 30% of all renters in the Midwest lived in communities of color, lower than the share of all renters in neighborhoods that had under 20% of people of color, which was about 45% of all renters. But even then in the Midwest, distressed renters were still more likely to reside in communities of color compared to neighborhoods where under 20% of residents were people of color. In the pulse survey, we also have a rich set of demographic data at the household level. So we can at least begin to look at the intersection between household and neighborhood characteristics. In our sample, not unlike the State of the Nation's housing figure I showed you earlier, lower income households and households of color were far more likely to fall behind on their rental payments from the period of April 2021 through February 2022. So 22% of lower income renters earning under $25,000 were behind on their rent, and that's more than 4 times the rate of rental arrears among high income households earning at least $75,000. On the right-hand side, you'll see that about 1/4 of Black renters were behind on their payments, compared with 19% of Hispanic, 18% of Asian, and just 9% of white renters. But how does that play out across different neighborhood contexts? Regardless of the neighborhood context, lower income renters are far more likely than higher income renters to be behind on their rent. Doesn't matter if they live in a higher poverty or lower poverty neighborhood, or in communities of color versus predominantly white neighborhoods, right? But when you look within income groups, so among those earning $25,000 or among those earning $25,000 to $50,000, households are most likely to be behind on their rent if they live in high poverty census tracts compared to low poverty census tracts. Similarly, at all income levels, households living in communities of color are most likely to fall behind on their rent. So nearly 1/4 of households earning under $25,000 were behind on their rent if they lived in high poverty neighborhoods or in communities of color. And that's a bit higher than the 22% of all lower income renters. The story isn't quite as clear cut by race and ethnicity, but we can say a couple of things generally. One, regardless of the neighborhood context, households of color are much more likely to fall behind on their rental payments compared to white households. A second thing, for all races and ethnicities, renters living in higher poverty neighborhoods had higher rates of non-payment than those living in lower poverty neighborhoods, even if there isn't a clear gradation, especially compared to the last slide. Okay, so given the disparities we observe in financial distress at the neighborhood level, it also made sense for us to examine whether or not emergency rental assistance funds were reaching the neighborhoods where the need was greatest. So according to our estimates, about 13% of renters had submitted an ERA application over the period under study, and about 1/3 of those renters had received emergency rental assistance. So just under 5% of all renters in the pulse survey. Here, the blue bars show the share of renters behind on rent, the measure we've looked at kind of throughout. The red bars show the share of ERA applicants, and the yellow bars show the share of all renters who received ERA. If you look at the neighborhood context of ERA disbursement, application and acceptance rates were higher in the neighborhoods that experienced higher rates of financial distress. So, for example, 17% of renters in high poverty tracts had applied for ERA, compared with 9% of renters in low poverty tracts. Encouragingly, that those patterns largely mirror the differences in rental arrears by neighborhood type. And that pattern is also true when broken down by race, ethnicity of the neighborhood. ERA applications and acceptance rates are greater in communities of color where the need is greatest as well. The concentration of ERA recipients also largely mirrors where renters report being behind on their payments. So about 2/5 of ERA recipients lived in higher poverty neighborhoods, while about 3/5 lived in communities of color. In both cases, the acceptance rates are in line with the distribution of renter households behind on their rent and across those neighborhood types. These findings suggest that on average, at least, emergency rental assistance has gone to the neighborhoods with the greatest need, or at least had the highest concentration of renters behind on their payments. But it's also important to note that other research suggests that this wasn't necessarily true everywhere and at all points in the program's rollout in different states. And beyond that, ERA spending itself wasn't a program designed to rectify longstanding disparities in housing insecurity and housing affordability in these communities. Still, our research points to the fact that ERA helped mitigate some of the disparities across neighborhoods that were likely exacerbated by the pandemic. It has been essential in keeping people stably housed, especially in hard-hit neighborhoods. So I'm going to conclude with a number of policy and research implications that stem from our findings. First, neighborhood characteristics can provide a helpful, even if incomplete, metric for understanding need in a community. So in our findings, right, higher poverty, lower income, and lower rent neighborhoods, as well as communities of color, had the highest incidence of non-payment of rent. And that remained true across regions and even for households at different levels of income. As a result of that, programs meant to alleviate financial distress experienced by both renter households and landlords should use neighborhood characteristics to better target areas with the greatest need. Likewise, geography can be an important part of evaluating ongoing or past programs, right? But it's important to note that incorporating neighborhood context into program design, into program implementation, into program evaluation can be done in combination with or to supplement information you get on individual households when that data is available. But neighborhood context can still be used instead of detailed household information when collecting that information is deemed too costly or too sensitive. If financial spillover effects are also geographically concentrated, then programs remedying the financial fallout of the pandemic more broadly, think unemployment insurance, think SNAP benefits, think stimulus payments, right? Those must also account for this concentration and reach neighborhoods with the greatest need. And lastly, this research also speaks to the importance of having timely data like the household pulse survey, and how important that's been for our work. It's helped us to understand the financial fallout of the pandemic as it has progressed, and its continuation will help shed further light on longer term challenges for renter households. So with that, I'm going to say thanks to everyone for tuning in and listening. I know we spent through a bunch of it, so I'm looking forward to any questions and comments folks have.
Oh, thank you, Alex, for a really terrific overview. We've gotten in a bunch of pretty interesting questions, and I encourage folks to both, if you have questions, to ask them, or look at questions that have been asked to see if there are any that you particularly want me to ask. And somebody did just ask if the slides and the video will be available, and both should be posted later today, and if they're not up by today, they certainly will be up by Monday. Let me start with, Alex, I was really struck by some of the regional variation, you know, about on a couple of key metrics, you know, 10 percentage points, and I'm trying to figure out what are some possible explanations for why there was such wide variation between regions.
Yeah, and so that's a great question, David. I don't know if I am going to have a full response. We suspect.
Yeah, I asked you to speculate.
Yeah, then not fully speculate.
Yeah,
I think in some cases some informed speculation, and I won't try to venture into uninformed speculation. As I mentioned, some of the major difference has to do with just where renters live in these communities, right, in the first place, right? So how common are these higher poverty neighborhoods, and where do these renters live within that context? I don't have a slide pulled up here that shows you the distribution of these renter households, but that's going to explain a good chunk of the variation here. Some other differences that I think are worth kind of pointing out, and I mentioned this briefly, is the divergence in some cases that's especially striking. So why in the Northeast in particular are these rates of non-payment so great? The differences between high and low poverty places, and in places where there are more people of color and less people of color. And like I said during the talk, that we think that has something to do with the higher levels of racial and economic segregation in the Northeast. It is an empirically testable question we didn't quite get to and fully kind of track down during our analysis. It is also kind of remains an open question. It's segregation isn't only common in the Northeast, right? It might be heightened. It might be more severe in certain pockets of the Northeast, of course, but it's not a phenomenon that exists in the Northeast alone. If we had broken this down at the metro area level, would that still hold true? I don't know. It's not something we were able to do for this talk, but it does explain some of the variations. And this shows just the rates, right? But this also shows some of the distribution of renters behind on rent and how that varies by region.
Interesting. It leads to a question, which I know it actually comes from Jared Schachner, a one-time Meyer Fellow here at the Joint Center, asking to what extent, he says, can I interpret the last slide as indicating minimal neighborhood effects? That it's not that, if I understand the question correctly, it's not that that the neighborhoods are causing certain outcomes. It's that certain outcomes are occurring, you know, in certain kinds of neighborhoods.
If does last slide refer to this slide where we start to kind of look at the household?
Yes. Sorry, I should have. Yes, that was a real-time question. Excuse me.
Yeah, no, and I mean, on some level, I think so. One, it's important to say that household characteristics matter a lot, right? But we think that the neighborhood characteristics matter too. I think is one of my takeaways. And the one way that becomes clear, and you could say this has something to do with the composition of households in these neighborhoods, right? But even if you look at within income groups, for example, right? Households that are lower income, those earning under $25,000, still experience the highest rates of non-payment when they're in higher poverty neighborhoods, right? And that holds true if you look at the differences by income and rent at the neighborhood level. And it holds true if you look at the neighborhood context by race and ethnicity on the right hand side of the same slide also, right? So I don't think it would be fair to say that neighborhood characteristics don't matter. I think they do. They also matter from a policy perspective, right? There are cases where you might not know much about the individual, their household characteristics, and from an evaluation standpoint, mid-program, right? When you're thinking about some of these different programs that went out to help renter households, to keep them in their homes, and to protect renter households, but you do know something about, in all those cases, oftentimes where renters live, right, and the neighborhood context that they exist in. So I think the purpose of this is to in some way spell out how neighborhood context matters, and in what context, right? It definitely matters for policy, and it still seems to matter in terms of individual outcomes on a number of levels.
There was a really interesting question about the extent of overlap between employment loss and falling behind on rent, and whether or not there are folks who were, can we tell, who were falling behind who hadn't lost income. And I guess related to that is, are you able to separate out folks who lost employment income from folks who lost some other form of income?
Yeah, we absolutely can. And we've done that in prior studies, right? It's certainly true. And you can see this in the public data. Households that lose income are far more likely to report being behind on their rent, right? So there's a certain amount of overlap in what we're reporting here. We didn't look at it so much for this study. In that prior study, I mentioned previously that Sophia Wedeen had presented a year ago. We looked at that a little more intentionally when thinking about to what extent households who lost employment income weren't able to meet their essential payments, and to what extent, right, this caused them to have to scale back on things like their rental payments, for example, right? And there's definitely a connection here, but it's not one we necessarily explored for the purposes of this talk.
Did you look at the? One thing that struck me on that, before you, when you were showing employment, loss of income and falling behind on rent, was it looked like about a 5 to 10 percentage point gap, regardless of income, in people. If 25% of people lost income, about 15% of people in that group might have reported falling behind on rent, which is consistent with, struck me as very consistent with the earlier research we've done, that people tapped other resources, whether it was whatever savings they had, family networks. But so I read that right, and I thought it was an important point worth underscoring. Were you able to tease out at all the extent of lost income and the extent to which, it's one thing to have lost 10% of your income versus 60% of your income, and I don't know if in this research or earlier research, the extent to which that may have varied by either income or race?
Yeah. So one, we do not observe it directly in these data, the extent of the income loss. In earlier waves of the pulse survey, you wouldn't observe the timing of the income loss. That's a little less relevant to the period under study here. But it is a potential issue with the pulse survey. And you'll even see differences in rates by income and race and ethnicity for folks who report an income loss and then go on to also report being behind on their payments, right? So some households are more likely to report falling behind on their rent after losing income. And that's especially true for lower income households, right? In particular, like households who might have less to fall back on after experiencing reduction in income. It was especially relevant earlier in the pandemic, thinking about the depth of income. So how much income was lost, right? What share of your household's income? One kind of peculiar thing that I don't think I show here at all. Let me see. I don't show here at all. But it kind of illustrates some of this to some extent, I think, is you see that pretty consistently in the Pulse survey that Hispanic households are more likely to report an income loss. But here, let me go to that real quick. Are more likely to report income losses, but relative to Black households or Black renters in particular, but are also less likely to report being behind on their rent. So there are some households who do have, right, the resources, or family structure or whatever to withstand or endure a kind of income loss and not fall behind on their rent. Or alternatively, right, the reduction in income could be shorter term, right? Could be related to a temporary leave rather than something longer term.
Do we have the discussion makes me wonder, do we, or you, have a metric of what would be a normal, and I'm going to put that in quotes, rate of people falling behind on rent? We have really interesting data on what happened in the middle of this pandemic, and as you say, particularly when the employment effects hit hard. But what would we think would be a kind of normal baseline?
Yeah. So one, we don't have great measures. It's certainly not comparable, a comparable indicator. To the extent I know, the Pulse survey is the first Census Bureau product to really use this question, and the Pulse survey changed how they asked this question on falling behind on rent relatively recently, and now even asks about how many months worth of rent you're behind, which is great to see, but is not reflected in these findings at all because it's a relatively new question that the Census Bureau has been asking. But I don't know if we have a great baseline. But think about some of those, the policy and research recommendations I kind of laid out at the end there, right? And one of them is how important this kind of timely, consistent, higher quality data is, something that comes out right every month and allows you to track these trends over time. We are starting to see shifts over time in the extent of non-payment, right? Right, like to the extent the Pulse survey kind of continues to develop, you might develop a kind of baseline, and over time you compare to earlier in the pandemic, especially going back to early 2021, early 2020, later 2020 and into 2021, rates of non-payment for renters were higher than they are now, and they've ticked down a couple of percentage points. So I think they went from around 17-ish% at their peak. I should have the data in front of me. I don't, but I believe it's about 17% at their peak at the end of 2021. For this period, it stayed pretty consistent around 15%, and then has kind of continued to fall, but ever so slightly down. I think it's now closer to about 13-ish%. But if any of my colleagues want to correct me on that, if they have the data pulled up in front of them, that would be great. So yeah, we're starting to develop that baseline, I think, which is an important reason to kind of continue this survey. Because there's an important question. It gives you some real insights into what renter households are facing and how that's kind of changed over time.
You anticipated part of my next question, which was saying, this paper focuses on, a particular chunk of time in 2022, and wondering both, what you are seeing now. The economy today is a lot different then, and the ERA and some of the other pandemic relief programs that helped households have ended or are ending. So I'm wondering, what are you seeing, and are there particular things that you're going to be tracking? I know that you're now hard at work on the state of the nation's housing, which is surely going to pick up on some of these themes.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot we're tracking. Harder to get into the neighborhood context of those changes, right? Because you've got to really dig in. Census Bureau, RDC stuff. We're not allowed to talk about things that we weren't able to release through the RDC or didn't release through the RDC. But I will. I mean, we looked at the timing of these things, right? Even within our sample, are some of the changes over time affecting what we're seeing, right? We've split our sample up into different ways, and the persistence of the neighborhood context and the extent of the neighborhood, like to what extent that varied, was pretty stable over time, in a way that we felt comfortable kind of pooling the much larger sample of close to a year, right? I think it's April 2021 to February 2022. Kind of bringing that forward, it's hard to say what would happen, like keeping it kind of the neighborhood story for just a second. I don't want to speculate blindly, right? But I'd suspect given the existing challenges in those neighborhoods that we're looking at, right, higher poverty and lower income neighborhoods in particular, I'd expect you'd still see disparities, of course. For kind of the state of the nation's housing report as we develop, we are and will be thinking about how the changes in the rental markets, right, are mattering for more vulnerable households in particular, of course, right. As rent growth kind of continues to moderate, as more supply, especially on the high end, continues to come online, to what extent are those benefits, if they are at all, being realized by lower income households that kind of suffered most during the pandemic, right? But that's still an open question, still something to kind of dig into for the state of the nation's housing and further.
Just to give folks a heads up, the work is underway on the state of the nation's housing. The report itself, as always, will come out in mid to late June. Stay tuned for that. Couple of questions that have come in through Q&A. Several people have commented on what appeared to be very large gaps between ERA applications and awards. I want to make sure we've read that right, and if you've got any sense as to what's going on there.
Yeah, I think so. Not all ERA applicants were eligible in the first place. Some got denied. The timing of ERA in different places probably precluded some of these applicants from having, right, like whether funds ran out in certain states, right, pretty infamously, larger states, the funding formulas that dictated ERA ran out of ERA funds a little quicker than smaller states, or much quicker in some places, right? And also the acceptance rates are lower, in part because some of these applicants are still waiting, right? So there's a third category not discussed here, and not really discussed in the paper at all, about those with an ER application that's still pending, right? So that explains some of the gaps. And I'm sure there are some other factors.
Yeah, and if memory serves, they got a little bit, I want to say loosened up. That's probably not quite right. Some of the requirements. I don't know if there was a change in approval rates over time, and if that was something that you were seeing. Also, a question you suggested, or I think you suggested, that we want to pay attention to targeting assistance to low income, heavily impacted neighborhoods, and at least one person wondered about, well, how would that affect folks who lived in low impact neighborhoods? How would we still reach those folks if we did targeting along the lines of what we thought you suggested?
Yeah, well, I think it's a means of evaluating, right? I don't think what I mean to suggest is not that emergency rental assistance funds or other kinds of funding would go exclusively to low income neighborhoods. You still need to reach people in need where they live, regardless of where that is. But the neighborhood context does provide you with an important criteria for evaluating, right? So if most renters live in a particular kind of place, which I think is something we are definitely seeing, if these the graph you're seeing right here was completely shifted, right? If a much larger share of ERA recipients were reported living in lower poverty neighborhoods or in neighborhoods where the share of people of color were under 20%, right? That would indicate a problem. So I think this, more than anything, or as much as anything, really gives you some baseline for kind of targeting and thinking through, not just targeting, right, but kind of evaluating and thinking through your kind of program outcomes, right? Does that make sense?
Yep. A couple questions about whether there's anything that you can say about either type of housing or ownership of housing. I think I know the answer to the latter, but did you see any difference? Is it possible to look at, and did you look at any differences in whether folks were living in a single family rental, a small, 1 to 4 unit, or a larger building? And I'll ask the question, is there anything that you can say about type of owner, particularly, mom and pop landlord versus large institutional owner?
Yeah, so the Pulse survey does allow you to look at the structure type, but we did not for this study. I know from other work, right, that rates of non-payment, and I believe this holds true. It certainly was true if you go back to 2021 and late 2020. Well, not late 2020. The Census Bureau only introduced the that question a year or two ago. But non-payment is higher in smaller multifamily units than in larger multifamily units, and that has something to do with the geography of those units. Has something to do with the kinds of tenants who live in those units on average, right? You mask a lot of disparities, of course, within those groups, but higher income folks tend to live in larger units. On the ownership type, we referenced some other literature that kind of looked at ownership, but for this study explicitly is not something we thought about. But it is important to be thinking about ownership and ownership type, right? Especially as it relates to, I mentioned kind of as part of the motivation, if your non-payment is concentrated, that means ultimately that disinvestment in rental properties will also likely be concentrated in those same neighborhoods. And many of those neighborhoods have been experiencing larger problems and have experienced, existing disparities that long precede the pandemic. You don't want to exacerbate those things. So yeah, no, that's not something we were able to address directly in this study.
It's an interesting question here about whether the Pulse includes a multiracial category. If so, can you highlight those findings? But it also kind of cues up a larger question that I know you and our other colleagues have been wrestling with about how to think about race and ethnicity, in a kind of contemporary society. So both, sort of specifically, but if you want to use that as an opportunity to sort of talk about the challenge of doing that, feel free.
Yeah. So the Pulse survey does not, I believe, there is a fifth group that I'm not reporting out here, but we do discuss a little bit in the paper of other households of other races and ethnicities that will include households that identify as 2 or more races, right? For convenience and simplicity's sake, I omitted that category from the presentation here. I don't think it's as detailed as splitting it. Like if you went to the American Community Survey or a much larger Census Bureau survey, you'd be able to look at, right, much more detailed race and ethnicity categories. But no, that's not a trend we were able to really explore here. Yeah, I mean, you're like obviously thinking about race ethnicity categorization is just how it's measured by the Census Bureau. Some of the changes that have come up in 2020, which I don't kind of probably beyond the scope of this presentation and talking about right now. But unfortunately, in this case, we're kind of confined with these smaller categories that the Pulse survey allows for. And I think that makes some sense given its size, right? The fact that you can get even this level of detail, I think, is great. And it's not complete. It's not everything you want. I don't know if our internal use and restricted access data allows us to really dig in further. I don't think that it does, but it actually might. That's something we should probably look into. So we can look at these trends beyond beyond every year when the American Community Survey, every 2 years when the American Housing Survey comes out, right, and actually get the more up-to-date kind of monthly trends, looking at that kind of breakdown.
Yep. One last question. Is there anything, as you went into this and or went through it, that really surprised you? Or I guess the flip of surprise is something you thought was really important, and when you were done, it was still really important.
Yeah, I think just this relationship. Oh, sorry, let me go the very basic one. This relationship was surprising, I think, to all of us on some level, is that these disparities weren't as striking as we thought they were, right? That difference between 19% in higher poverty neighborhoods and 12% in lower poverty neighborhoods, maybe not as large as you'd think. But right at the same time, that distribution of renters behind on rent and where they live, right, like started to kind of bring that into focus. I don't know. I mean, because that's also a key finding. I'm not sure it's fair to say that's surprising, but it was surprising to us to see that small difference, and then that how the distribution kind of helped really kind of illuminate some of the disparities.
Yeah. Well, Alex, I'm sorry to those of you whose questions we can't get to, but we are out of time. In fact, we're over by a minute or two. So I'll be brief. I think, ending here is really important because it reminds us, that some of these are really high numbers, right? That 40% of renters in high poverty neighborhoods fell behind, or, were behind on rent. And, those are all individuals, all in households, all in communities. And as you've, I think underscored for us, that it affects both individuals, and the communities that they live in. And it's just a really important reminder, as we hopefully come out of the pandemic, to remember those impacts, to keep paying attention, and not forget some of the important lessons that we've learned here. On behalf of all of the folks here, I want to thank you, and I want to thank all of the folks who've taken the time and provided so many thoughtful questions. Thanks a lot, and have a great day, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.